This is Brian.
He's over there.
I don't know where he is in relation to my own
Oh,
photo.
he's to your right.
To my right. Here's Brian.
Yeah.
Left.
There we go. um, and I don't remember where you teach, Brian, so can you tell our audience?
Sure, I teach at Cumberland University it's just outside of Nashville, Tennessee. And it's a very small university that is 175 years old.
And
Yay!
and you are one of the only professors, music professors in America that uses Saito method, I believe,
Um,
that I know of.
I think so. I know there have been a few others who've studied Saito, but I do not know if they've incorporated it into their programs. And I guess I would say it would need more than a workshop to do that.
Oh, I completely agree with that. When I took
Yeah.
the workshop the first time, I thought I understood it, and then I, I needed to take it a second time, and I think I need to take it many times until I can begin to really grasp it.
Sure, I think I felt that too.
Did you do any studying outside of the workshop for Saito?
Yes,
Like,
I
how did you
studied
do it?
with those, and I went up and spent a week with him. Um, I'm trying to think. It was in the early 90s.
Oh, wow. How did you hear about Saito in the first place, and what got your interest?
Well, when I was in grad school, I had a teacher by the name of Roy Cox who had studied in Japan, and it was just a random thing. I took a conducting course with him, and that's where I first found out about it. But Wayne Toes had sent he'd written the book, and I think this was in the 80s, the late 80s. He'd sent a brochure about the book to various universities. And for some reason, I always kept the brochure because it fascinated me. And if I eventually made contact with him and went up to see him and studied with him for a week, and then it took a while before I got back, but then I kept on going back. Um,
So this goes back to the 80s for you. That's pretty crazy.
yeah,
What was your first impression of it? Like, what was your reaction when you first kind of got a glimpse of it?
there's no way that I can do this.
Oh, that's funny.
It definitely, if you're used to something else, it's definitely a challenge. Like it pulls you out of what you're comfortable with, right?
Sure. It was, can I please hit my head against the wall? It would feel better.
Wow.
But
Yeah.
I had to leave and I had to think about it and to decide whether it was valuable for me or not. And I think, Brittany, you're right. Once you've learned what you perceive is your technique, then to shift that is monumental.
hmm
Um, but I'm glad that I made the effort because it's paid off.
How many years into your career were you at this point?
Ooh, that's a great question. Probably, hmm, probably 10, 15.
Okay.
And how many years did it take you until you felt like you could do it?
I still don't feel like I can do it.
Yes,
Uh,
you can. We've seen you conduct.
I think it took me about 3 years before I felt really comfortable. But I had the privilege of having an ensemble, so I got to practice on them, whether they knew it or not. So, you know,
That's a good segue, Brittany, into your first question.
Yeah. So when you started studying Saito, like what kind of did you find that it was easy to apply it into choral music?
mm, Well, I think it is easy in that we use a lot of shukui in choral conducting. And so you have to challenge yourself to use other gestures. And I think in instrumental conducting, you have more of an opportunity to use a lot of gestures that are more than shakui. Um, so, for me, it had to be. I love when I have to problem solve with all of the other tools that we've been given. That becomes fun. So it's still exciting. But as a choral, I'm not sure that I don't think I'm a pioneer by any stretch of the imagination. It just kind of happened. And I like the way that it happened.
If you're doing choral music, why would you use shakui instead of haikinundo?
Well, shukui is you do a lot of uh, scoopy sounding music. Yes, certainly music has all of the components that instrumental music does too. But choral singing is very, in my opinion, very shakui-like. And everything else fits into that.
Okay. And if anyone's listening who's not familiar with the term, shakui is kind of like the first gesture we learned in the workshop, and it's a scoop with a slight acceleration down.
Yes, like it's a ladle. It's like you have a ladle, and yes, there is an acceleration down and a deceleration up.
Yeah.
And it's very easy to follow too. So I mean, that's another reason.
Say that again. I didn't hear you.
Oh, I said it's a very easy gesture to follow. Like for somebody that's never seen Saito, it's very easy to follow.
It is, and also in our instruction, I think 80% of music can be conducted in a shigoi. If you didn't know anything else, you could get by with doing that.
Yeah, I think I could agree with that.
What sort of reaction did you get from your colleagues over the years about Saito conducting?
Well, because the musical community is such a sensitive bunch, I think anything that's new and challenging for people who are well trained becomes a challenge. So I have enjoyed working with orchestras and choir together. But what's very interesting to me is that once you've honed the choir, then you've got to pull an orchestra along. It becomes a difficult task. And sometimes I often ask myself the question, why aren't you listening to the choir? Because they're spot on. So some of it is you'd want to have an ensemble under your baton for as long as you possibly can. And once they're used to your way of doing things, I think it becomes really easy. And that becomes easier.
That makes sense. I think ego plays a big part in it too, with colleagues.
Indeed.
Because the ego blocks you from trying new things.
Yes. And quite, there have been many wars fought over nothing.
Yeah.
But it's always interesting. It's a great question because and your concept of the ego is extremely well taken. Sometimes that just gets in the way. If we can make music the focal point, rather than the gesture, gesture's there to help us. But if we can take that ego out and make music the focal point, then we can shift some things, I think.
I think Wayne would agree with you for sure. Because Wayne always talks, I personally get too involved in the gestures, but Wayne always brings it back to the music. So I think he would definitely agree.
Well, but, for me, Wayne Toes has been just the most phenomenal teacher and pedagogue and friend and mentor. Um, so I think I've been able to glean from him those wonderful concepts, that I didn't learn from anyone else. Mm-hmm. So I'm extremely grateful for that.
Me too.
Mm-hmm.
Brittany.
Yeah.
You up there?
So kind of speaking of Wayne and being a great mentor, kind of tying in with that. I mean, I'm assuming that's one of the reasons, but what else drew you back to the workshop so many times? Like, did you have specific goals you wanted to accomplish, or what was the drawing factor there?
The drawing factor was I had to get this right for myself. And so coming back to the workshops, it's always a time for me to tighten up my skills. And I think as I've gotten older, I've realized that I don't know it all, and I'm good with learning from other people, as long as they have something to teach me. And it's within that environment that I found a lot of people had a lot to teach me. And so I valued that, and so it became a collaborative opportunity, and I met such wonderful people, such as yourselves, and had a lot of fun over the years. So there's just a lot of personal reasons why I still come back.
For sure.
And then over the years when you took the workshop, what sort of variety of students have you seen take it, and what sort of reactions have you seen them have?
Oh, that's a great question. I see there are students who come with the idea that they're going to learn the methodology, whatever it is. There are students who come who are there to demonstrate how wonderful they are. I've always called Saito the great equalizer. It's like the day we die. It doesn't matter how much money you have. It just doesn't matter. Excuse me. And Saito is that great equalizer. It doesn't matter how many degrees you have behind your name or what experience you have behind your name. You still have to learn to put the gesture into the baton. And that's the great equalizer.
Yeah.
That's a really great quote.
Yeah.
But there have been interesting things to observe in people over the years. People going through their own personal stuff. And so conducting is actually a way to watch the soul of those people, if you know how to do it. And so there are people who are very guarded. Mm-hmm. And I might have been one of those. Maybe I still am. And had to learn how to open up a little more. And there are people who do not want that emotion to escape from that heart. So from that perspective, you get all kinds of people. All of them have been wonderful. A few of them have been jerks. But they're more wonderful people than jerks.
Thank goodness for that.
Indeed.
So, kind of tying into that, what's the strangest thing that's ever happened at one of the workshops you've attended?
In generic terms, or for me personally?
Either one.
Well, the strangest thing last time was working with one of the pianists, and we had agreed on what we'd do, and I knew we were using a second pianist, but the pressure was on, and I forgot to tell her that we weren't doing a repeat. So that was kind of strange, but it kind of worked out, and just, you go on, and welcome to life.
Yeah.
What other strange things? I think there are just some people who who decide that Saito needs to be something that it's not, and they're going to make it that. And um, it never works out.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that? Like, what might they try to make it?
Well, they're trying to make it uh, what they think it should be musically. And so maybe by that I mean when it's their turn to put the gesture into the baton, all of the musical concepts fall apart unless you can put it into the baton, because that's the idea of Saito.
Mm-hmm.
So what if I had to make a distinction? There's conducting where people are beating time, and they've got wonderful ensembles who, once they get started, are fine. They probably don't need any of us.
Mm-hmm.
The beauty of Saito is that you're putting into the gesture specific musical ideas, and that is the difficulty, is to communicate those musical ideas. And can you change it at the drop of a hat because you know something's going to take a left turn really quickly? What can you do to save it? And those are the fun things about that, I think. The fun about Saito is because it keeps you on your toes. You're not merely beating time. I don't know if that helps or not.
It does. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
tremendously. The next one is related to that, and this is kind of a big question. What flaws do you perceive in non-Saito conducting methods, and what do you think Saito teaches that other conducting methods might miss?
I haven't actually found another methodology. I think there have been awfully good books over the years. So it's hard for me to say, well, I want to compare this method with that method. I've searched, but I don't think I've been successful in finding other methods. There may be other ways that people do conduct, and certainly there are. What I find very disturbing is that conductors, as I look at them, usually have two movements to one sound. I don't know if that's a good way of putting it. That's because they're getting everybody to sound on the rebound. So it comes after the fact. And to do that, you have to have two movements before you get to the sound. And so, I mean, as you both know, learning how to accelerate and decelerate, they're simply principles of physics. Throwing a tennis ball in the air and catching it, you know when it's going to hit, and that's what you're doing with your baton or with your hand. You're throwing essentially the tennis ball up in the hand, and you know it's there. So that's the difference for me.
So the difference is the stuff before the afterbeat, like the acceleration into it. Is that what you meant?
Well, yeah. I mean, there are a number of movements that go into a gesture, but certainly there's the deceleration and then the acceleration in. Mm-hmm. When I can see that, I know when to respond.
Have you ever been in a situation where a colleague or a conducting professor or even just a conductor said something completely contrary to what Saito teaches?
Probably. I mean, at the risk of being critical, because musicians are always critical.
Sure.
I still have to go back to ask myself, what are you telling the ensemble to do? And it's not necessarily the method, it's what are you telling them to do? And many times I don't know what they're telling people to do.
Mm-hmm.
I watched a young conductor conduct a symphony orchestra. He gave 2 cutoffs. They all chose the second one, fortunately.
Oh.
There were 2 cutoffs, but nobody was aware that there were 2 cutoffs. So that's part of what the methodology does. I think it creates this hyper awareness of what we're doing. And so when I come back to a workshop, I appreciate when the instructor says, your deceleration is not long enough.
I can appreciate the hyper awareness, because I felt like it gave me, even if I can't do it yet, I felt like it gave me a new set of eyes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I can watch any gesture, and I have sort of like a way to categorize it now.
sure.
Yeah.
And in fairness to all musicians, I think musicians can bring these incredible skills together. But I also think that the methodology allows you more freedom to conduct rather than more restrictiveness.
Mm.
You have more tools you can pull from, kind of
Yeah.
subconsciously.
Yeah.
Speaking of tools to pull from, Brittany.
Speaking of tools to pull from, if you have to go into your toolbox and pull out one, which one is your favorite?
We're talking about gesture?
Yes.
Wow. I don't think I have a favorite, but if I had a favorite, okay.
I guess I do have a favorite.
I guess I do. I love taffy pulling.
Oh. Yeah.
Do you actually use that in your conducting?
I do.
Really?
Yes. It was an interesting thing. I was accompanying a student in a voice class, and the instructor had asked the student to pull taffy. And all the student did was this. And so I asked, if you could pull taffy with acceleration and deceleration, you'd actually tell me when you wanted me to play. And so she did that. And suddenly it became this different thing. Yeah, I do use taffy pulling.
Cool.
I wouldn't have expected that one.
When you're in your ensemble, I've found that if you just allow your creative juices to flow, you can do anything. You can twiddle your thumbs or blink your eyes. They will go with it because they understand what you're doing with deceleration and acceleration. So have fun with it.
I feel like that gives me a lot to think about.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, that's
still on the learning path. So isn't that great?
yeah.
I think you're just such a great role model for how, you just continue to keep learning and growing, and you've never said, okay, I'm done. I know everything there is to know. Right? That's inspiring.
I think part of that is that I think when you get your degree, as soon as they give you the piece of paper, it's a past event. And I think to continuously learn and to continuously be present with that learning is the greatest reward. So the pieces of paper are just merely their means to an end, not an end in themselves. And I think that's the distinction.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
have fun learning.